There's a weird horseshoe theory thing that's happening here. We've talked about it before on the program, that you have this constellation of far leftists who are rather friendly toward Hamas, who generally are isolationist on foreign policy, but they're isolationist on foreign policy mainly because they believe that the United States is a nefarious force in the world. They're sort of Howard Zinn or Noam Chomsky with regard to American foreign policy. America is actually bad. That horseshoe theory has now swung all the way around, and it includes some people on the right. Now, as we'll talk about in a moment, when it comes to isolationism, as we've discussed, there are a bunch of different perspectives within the isolationist perspective. There is the we should not get involved in foreign conflicts no matter what perspective because we need the money here at home, which means that you're also in favor of cutting spending by the government on a wide variety of other subjects. There's also an isolationism that suggests that whenever America gets involved in foreign conflicts, that tends to taint the United States, not it's about the United States tainting the rest of the world. But there is a theory that has now arisen on the right that there is something deeply malign about the United States, something deeply wrong with the United States. This was made apparent over the weekend. Tucker Carlson was on Joe Rogan's show. Obviously, I'm very friendly with Joe. I think Joe does a great job during his interviews. And there was a clip from this interview that went particularly viral. This is a clip in which Tucker Carlson calls the United States evil for having dropped the atomic bomb on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in 1945, ending World War II, and then suggests that anyone who would justify that is also evil, which is a very traditionally left-wing perspective. It is not traditionally a particularly right-wing perspective because most people on the conservative side of the aisle tend to believe that America is a force for good in the world. And as we'll discuss, it turns out that dropping the atomic bomb on Japan was necessary for ending World War II and likely saved millions of lives, both American and Japanese. But here is Tucker.
Well, you could say the same about the atomic bomb, right?
Yes, you could.
And you could say that we have to develop it like Oppenheimer felt before the Nazis did.
I love that. How'd that work? How'd that work?
Well,
I love, by the way, that people on my side, I'll just admit it, on the right, have spent the last 80 years defending dropping nuclear weapons on civilians. Like, are you joking?
Right.
That's just like prima facie evil.
Yeah.
If you can't, if we hadn't done that, then this, that, the other thing, that was actually a great savings. Like, no, it's wrong to drop nuclear weapons on people. And if you find yourself arguing that it's a good thing to drop nuclear weapons on people, then you are evil. Like it's not a tough one, right? It's not a hard call for you. It's not a hard call for me. So with that in mind, like, why would you want nuclear weapons? It's like just a mindless, childish sort of intellectual exercise to justify, like, oh no, it's really good because someone else will get it. How about no? How about like spending all of your effort to prevent this from happening?
Okay, actually, what would be childish is to assume that there are no other players in the world, for example, trying to develop nuclear weapons. The fact is the Nazis were trying to develop nuclear weapons. There was, in fact, a nuclear arms race that was happening at the time. Not only that, as it turns out, the Soviet Union then developed nuclear weapons. And it is mutually assured destruction and nuclear deterrence that has kept the world largely from sinking into another World War III-like mass casualty morass because of the horror of dropping the nuclear bomb on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in the first place. By the way, when he says things like, how exactly would you justify, why are we talking about how many lives it would save? It's just wrong to drop the bomb. Well, no, actually, if you end up saving more lives than are cost by the dropping of the atomic bomb, then it is morally justified to drop the atomic bomb. And that happens to be the reality of the situation. Evan Thomas wrote in the Washington Post fairly recently, the commanders of the Japanese armed forces were fanatics. On August 9th, after Washington dropped the second bomb on Nagasaki, Japan's war minister, General Korichika Anami, asked his fellow members of the Supreme War Council, quote, would not it be wondrous for the whole nation to be destroyed like a beautiful flower? The rulers were fatalistic about taking the rest of the nation with them. The 1 million will die for the emperor was a common headline in the state-controlled press. Even after Hiroshima and Nagasaki had been destroyed, and after the Russians had even invaded Japanese-occupied Manchuria, 6 members of the Supreme War Council deadlocked 3-3 on whether to surrender. After the dropping of the second bomb, when Emperor Hirohito decided that he wanted to end the debate and surrender, he had to run away from members of his own military who were threatening to kidnap him and who were trying to find the recording of him surrendering before it could be broadcast on radio to destroy the recording. So yes, it turns out that it was necessary. By the way, if we had not dropped the atomic bomb on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the alternative was either an amphibious assault that would have cost probably 1 million American lives, or more likely a giant blockade of the island of Japan, including the mass starvation of the civilian population, which would have resulted in millions of dead Japanese. So why is Tucker just abandoning the moral equation here at all? What is he doing here? That's what's sort of fascinating. Now, I think to understand what Tucker's doing here, you have to understand that this particular interview included a lot of conspiratorial thinking. So he tries to explain it. He says that he was actually radicalized by 2017. That basically until 2017, he believed a lot of narratives that were told by the government and by the mainstream media. And then after 2016, 2017, when it appeared that the intelligence community was militarized against Donald Trump, this is what radicalized him into basically becoming uber critical of everything. This is his story.
Probably unlike you, I didn't have any opinions like that. I was like, fluoride, come on. Yeah. UFOs, you're crazy. You know what I mean? I just I had this reflexive, I'm ashamed of it. I'm not bragging about it. But it was 2017, and really it was the Trump campaign. It wasn't that I was like so in love with Trump, though I've always liked Trump because he's like hilarious and charming and all that. But I wasn't like a Trumper or anything. But it was watching that campaign, and particularly his claim that they were spying on him. And I was like, really? You're not... The intel services and federal law enforcement, FBI, do not spy on presidential campaigns. Like, that's so out of the realm. That's so crazy. Like, that could never happen because, of course, there's no democracy in a system like that. And fundamentally, we're a democracy, an imperfect one. It kind of lumbers along, but like it's not fake. And then that turned out to be true. And I knew it was true. And that just blew my mind. So I began a process still ongoing of reassessing a lot of other things. Like, okay, well, if that was not true, what else is not true? And what else that they told me was a conspiracy theory might actually have some basis in fact. And
okay, so in other words, he went all the way from, I believe all the narratives to I believe none of the narratives. In fact, I believe the counter of the set of facts with which I am presented. Now, first of all, let me just say about 2016, 2017. Yes, it is incredibly disturbing that the intelligence community was militarized against Donald Trump on the basis of a bunch of trumped up nonsense from the Hillary Clinton campaign. Also, if this exploded your worldview as a conservative, that I find that surprising. Because as a conservative, you're supposed to be generally skeptical of government power. And not only that, if you know anything about presidential history, you know that a wide variety of presidential campaigns have been spied on by the administration in power. In 1940, for example, the Wendell Willkie campaign was pretty clearly spied on by the FBI at the behest of FDR. In 1964, LBJ literally bugged Barry Goldwater's headquarters in 1964. Famously, in 1972, the Richard Nixon campaign spied on the campaign of George McGovern, right? That's what Watergate was all about. So actually, there's a fairly well-predicated history of the instruments of law enforcement being misused, which is why there's been a hot debate about the utility of various law enforcement agencies on the right. This has been going on literally my entire lifetime and well before. Okay, but according to Tucker, that radicalized him. And now he went from supposedly believing everything to believing the reverse of everything. Now, that is actually not critical thinking. That's actually not critical thinking. If what you said is, I took in everything too much, too easily without examining the evidence, and so now I'm going to take a stronger look at the evidence before I come to a conclusion, that would be critical thinking. But saying that the evidence that is presented to you is now of no consequence whatsoever, that no evidence provided is sufficient because the source cannot be trusted, that they are lying to you, that they're always lying to you, always, and that no counter evidence is necessary to support your new thesis because, again, they're lying to you and they've hidden all the evidence. We are now in the world of the unfalsifiable. Any evidence against your new thesis is discounted by the fact that it's coming from a source that lies to you, and no evidence for your thesis is available. Why? Because they hid it and they are lying to you. We'll get some more on this in a moment. First, $20 barely buys you anything these days. You can't fill your gas tank for under $20. But you know what $20 will get you? Well, from the cell phone company I use, Pure Talk, you can get unlimited talk, text, and plenty of 5G data for just $20 a month. Pure Talk gives you the same quality of service as your current cell phone provider, but for about half the cost. The average family saves almost $1,000 a year, all with no contracts and no activation fees. You can switch to Pure Talk and keep the phone and phone number you currently use, or you can take advantage of their great deals on the latest iPhones and Androids. Making the switch, it's incredibly easy. Their U.S. customer service team can help you join Pure Talk in as little as 10 minutes. Choose to spend your hard-earned money with a wireless company that shares your values, supports our military and veterans, creates American jobs, and refuses to advertise on, the fake news networks. Stop spending an insane amount of money on your phone plan. Go to puretalk.com/Shapiro. Right now, my listeners can get an additional 50% off their very first month of coverage. That's puretalk.com/Shapiro. Again, Pure Talk, puretalk.com/Shapiro. They've got an incredible tower network. The coverage is excellent, and you're spending money on a company that actually likes you. Go to puretalk.com/Shapiro to get started. So then it comes down to, what is the thesis that Tucker is using? What is the narrative that Tucker is backing? Well, as he says, he is using the thesis that every single power that exists in the United States is lying to you about everything, down to the most basic morality of Americanism. Things like, was America right to involve itself in World War II? Was America right to drop a nuclear weapon on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in order to end the war? Now listen, as always, when Tucker talks, there's a grain of truth to much of what Tucker says. There's truth, a lot of truth, to the idea that a lot of our powerful institutions have been corrupted and that people inside those institutions have used that power in order to lie and change the narrative. But there is a difference, again, between healthy skepticism, a demand for evidence. That's what skepticism is. Right? Being critical, being a critical thinker is a demand for evidence. That is not the same thing as just asking questions. Just asking questions means the search for answers is totally worthless, and all the answers are deemed insufficient anyway. When you start thinking that being a critical thinker is just the asking of the questions rather than critically evaluating evidence and claims and counterclaims, that's wrong. If you're the kind of person who just asks questions, that's actually childish. Because the goal in life is to seek the answers, not just to ask the questions. A critical thinker might look at the evidence being presented and might evaluate it one way or another and sift through the data. But quote unquote, just asking questions is not the end of the story. Because if it's the end of the story, then the kinds of questions you're asking is in fact the narrative that you're seeking to promulgate. So what exactly is Tucker's narrative? Well, his narrative is that there's something deeply wrong in the soul of America. And what's more, there's been something wrong with the soul of America for generations. Now, again, a lot of conservatives do believe there's something wrong with the soul of the country. I believe, for example, there's been something wrong with the soul of the country since, for example, the sexual revolution of the 1960s, which undermined marriage, since the decline of religion in the United States, particularly in mainline Protestant churches, but across the spectrum. And that's been going on for generations. And more people need to go back to church. That we do have a soul sickness in this country, and that's largely mirrored the declining religiosity of the American population. But Tucker doesn't just go that far. He thinks that it goes deeper. Tucker has another critique. Tucker literally says this, okay? So I'm not attributing to Tucker a view he doesn't hold. And if I am, I'm happy for him to correct me. We've invited him on the show multiple times. Tucker has another critique. America lost its moral credibility during World War II. Now, again, this is the same argument that he makes with Joe that everybody is now latching onto, but he made this argument months ago when he was on with Russell Brand.
And I do think there are war crimes that the United States committed during the Second World War, the firebombing of Tokyo, famously Dresden, that were collective punishment. And I would also say, by the way, the atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, that's collective punishment.
Yes.
Okay? And I think that rotted the soul of the West. I do.
Yes.
I think that's so immoral that it did two things. One, you carry the burden of sin at scale like that. You just do. You can't help it. And two, that level of power in the hands of human beings convinced them that they were gods.
Yes, it's curious because you would hear a comparable argument offered for slavery, for example, that this burden is borne by American culture, and yet I've never heard anyone advance it around the acts of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. I wanted to...
We dropped atomic weapons on civilian populations.
Yes.
Now, I'm not endorsing Imperial Japan.
Yes.
And it was an imperial power in the worst sense. Horrible government. However, you can't annihilate a civilian population and call yourself the good guy. I don't care. I love America. I will defend America almost under any circumstances. You can't defend that.
Well, I mean, I at this point, I kind of want to know which circumstances, because I feel like the defense of America, especially on the foreign policy sphere, just for Tucker, does not exist particularly a lot. Again, I have the same views as Tucker does when it comes to closing the southern border. I have many of the same views that Tucker does about the decreasing religiosity of the West. In fact, I think I've been saying it longer than Tucker has probably. But what's weird here is that when Tucker is criticizing the United States as embodying some sort of original sin that sprang from World War II, is that Tucker actually doesn't believe this about foreign leaders killing people. So when it comes to the moral calculus of leaders killing people, that's the realm of normal politics. So for example, he will downplay Vladimir Putin's evil in killing his political opponents and invading sovereign countries and killing civilian populations in those sovereign countries by basically saying all leaders kill people. But when it comes to ending World War II by dropping the bomb in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, which did bring an end to the war, that is a moral stain, a moral blight that America simply has been corrupted by. So here he was talking about Vladimir Putin killing people. Again, this is just a couple of months ago.
You should challenge some ideas. For instance, you didn't talk about freedom of speech in Russia. You did not talk about Navalny, about assassinations, about the restrictions on opposition in the coming elections.
I didn't talk about the things that every other American media outlet talks about.
Why?
Exclusively.
Yes, this
because
is my
those
question.
are covered, and because I have spent my life talking to people who run countries in various countries and have concluded the following: that every leader kills people, including my leader. Every leader kills people. Some kill more than others. Leadership requires killing people. Sorry. That's why I wouldn't want to be a leader.
Because that's very blasé about leaders killing people. But when it comes to ending World War II, then all of a sudden the United States bears the stain of a giant blood guilt that can never be alleviated. Or if it can be, he has not really spelled out. So this isn't actually America First, ironically. This is actually kind of fascinating. It's something else. So the America First movement, right, which is the isolationist movement that was very well trafficked and very popular in 1939, 1940, before it took a late turn into overt anti-Semitism. It actually had a lot of prominent Americans early on, because in 1939, 1940, it was very unclear whether the United States needed to get involved in the war. The case that was being made by interventionists was that Britain was about to fall. If Britain fell, then Germany would dominate the entire continent of Europe, and then it could take its time, it could build up its naval resources, it would take control, for example, of the British Navy, and then it could threaten the United States. That was the case interventionists were making. Isolationists were saying we are very far away from Europe. There is no reason for us to be involved. Remember the last time we got involved, a lot of Americans died. Many prominent Americans were members very early on of the America First movement, including, for example, JFK and Gerald Ford when they were young men. Charles Lindbergh, who's the most associated with America First, was not formally associated with America First until about 1941. That's when he formally joined the America First movement. But there's something that should be said here about American isolationists prior to World War II. Those American isolationists, generally, their worry was not that America's involvement would be bad for the world. Their worry was that Europe's wars would harm America, that America was a pristine place we needed to build up at home, that America had to focus in on itself and keeping itself pristine from the old world politics. We didn't want to get involved in the balance of power jousting that happened in Europe all the time. Instead, we needed to keep ourselves safe because America is better, not because America is worse. But Tucker is saying something else. He's saying that America is and has historically been a nefarious force in foreign policy, which is actually a left-wing argument from the 1960s, that America bears blood guilt. In fact, it sounds a lot more like radical protesters on today's college campuses than like a traditional conservative. You hear that when Russell Brand says to him. It sounds like what you are saying about Hiroshima and Nagasaki is what the left is saying about the history of race in the United States, that America bears blood guilt, that America is in its essence guilty and corrupt and sinful. That's a very strange perspective, and it's not traditionally conservative. Just like, again, you can believe it, but it's not traditionally conservative. Tucker's narrative does have one important utility. It makes him the go-to source for everything. So to get back to his just asking questions, in this unfalsifiable world, right, where you can't trust anything, you can't believe what you see, you can't believe evidence provided because everybody's lying to you, and counter evidence is unnecessary because they hid all of it. This means the only person you can trust is the person who promulgates the reverse of any traditional narrative you've been hearing in America. It's a pure reaction against whatever is the story of the day. Whether it's true, whether it's false is irrelevant. It's just whatever is the story has to be false because I don't like the people who are telling the story. So they're hiding 9/11. And America's evil for Hiroshima. And Alex Jones is just as solid an informational source as anyone else, which is Tucker actually suggested he was prophetic on Joe Rogan's show. All our members of Congress, again, something that Tucker said on the show, every single one, effectively, are subject to blackmail by the intelligence agencies. According to Tucker, you have to believe Tucker. And if you don't, it's probably because you're part of the conspiracy or the cover-up, because you're owned, because you become the establishment, because you're weak and you can be taken over by nefarious forces. The only man of courage in this routine is apparently the truth seeker Tucker, who asks questions but doesn't actually examine the evidence on these particular issues, because why do you need to know things when you can just ask questions? And what's the point of trying to find things out when all the sources are themselves corrupted? Now, once upon a time, there was a young man who set fire to this exact narrative. His name was Tucker Carlson. Here he was discussing another isolationist politician with an attraction to some rather ugly conspiracies and some questions about World War II.
Well, I mean, I think everyone would agree with America First in lowercase. I mean, the idea that
we're all Americans here, and American interests are paramount, at least to Americans. But I think it's America First in capitals, the America First movement of the 30s and 40s that Buchanan's comments remind a lot of people of, and that's what people find creepy. I mean, I think that, the sovereignty of the American military, et cetera, I mean, these are not just crank issues. But unfortunately, Pat Buchanan raises them in a way that I think is discredited. And when it's hacked, he can always fall back on the line, well, the tiny cabal that controls American politics doesn't like me because I speak truth to power. This is actually, incidentally, almost verbatim what he said the other day, that I offend the plutocracy, that I'm a wanted man by the inside the Beltway people, and in every sense cast himself as a victim who is sort of a Karen Silkwood of politics, someone who's so truthful that he's being hunted down by the conspiracy that runs Washington. I mean, it's all a bit much. Maybe Pat Buchanan just says things that are kind of kooky, and that's why he's being criticized.
Now, Tucker Carlson might want to take a note from Tucker Carlson. Are you tired of the lies and the twists of the mainstream media talking points? Yeah, me too. Join me in my newest series, Fact, where I dismantle and bring truth to this tiring mainstream agenda.